Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 52, being recorded on Thursday, October 13. Yesterday we did our regularly scheduled stream, Wednesday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. And I had pulled COVID articles. I thought that we were going to do that. I announced that at the beginning of the video. We wound up taking the entire video to talk about another worthwhile subject, which is employee ownership, worker co-ops, ESOPs, a little bit of anarchism. That was a very good stream, actually, I thought. And as far as worker ownership and the labor movement, is it a help or a hindrance? So definitely go check out that S4A live stream number 51 if you're interested in those topics. And if you're a socialist, you should be interested in those topics, I think. But today we're going to actually get to the COVID articles, and otherwise we're just going to kind of shoot the shit in the chat. Reminder to the 30 people in the chat right now, if there's a troll, do not engage. I will check back in with the chat and I will get rid of them. If they're... Anyway, just don't do anything. That's probably the best thing for now. Anyway, so like I said, we are going to get into COVID. So let me just first of all thank the patrons for today. We'll get that out of the way so that isn't left hanging at the end. I was just telling the chat, I resized the image thing, and boy, I screwed up the settings. So there we go. I guess that's about as close. I'll try to fix this before the next live stream. But anyway, thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. It's slightly off center. Patreon.com/socialismforall is where you can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. I would make videos even if nobody supported, but the support allows me to spend more time on it. So again, thanks very much to the patrons. It's really, really appreciated. And again, I am spending a lot more time on this than I'd be able to do without your support. If the channel looks a little bit light on audiobooks lately, it's because the last audiobook I put up was 4 hours long. I am also currently working on the next installment. I think it's number 21 in the basic Marxism-Leninism playlist. It is Engels Anti-Düring Part 1. So there's 3 parts to Anti-Düring. Each one is like 4 or 5 hours long. And obviously when I'm working on that, it takes a very long time versus, a 20-minute or a 30-minute audiobook. I can't do it in one sitting. It's more like, 5 to 8 sittings, something like that. So, there can be sort of a break on the channel when I'm not uploading as much when I'm working on one of those. That said, I do plan to do some, that'll be up by the end of the month, definitely. In the meantime, I will be doing other shorter audiobooks. I have a whole slew of things that I would like to put up there on the channel. There's some things about nationalism from other authors. There's some things about women's liberation and socialism. There's some things about Lenin's view on bourgeois elections. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to be going up. Probably this weekend, probably Saturday, I'll upload, 3 to 5 shorter audiobooks, and there will be more stuff next week. And then, again, I am in the background working on Anti-Düring Part 1 so that we can keep the basic Marxism-Leninism playlist rolling along. It's been a long time since I updated that playlist because Anti-Düring is so long, and I just, especially this past summer, there was a lot of stuff I wanted to get to, and just setting aside like 2 weeks to work on a super long 4-hour audiobook, I wasn't really able to do it. So anyway, but yeah, thanks again to the patrons. Boy, this thing is really messing with me today. Let's get that going there. Okay. Don't know why it's doing that every single time, but I'm gonna have to figure that out. All right, so let's talk COVID for a minute. Let's jump right into it, and then I'll go back and forth between the chat. Oh no, is this going to be a problem every time that I put a picture on the screen? It probably is. Oh well. You know what? Let's start off on a completely different note. Not COVID. I'm gonna stick something else in there. And yeah, this stream is gonna be. I'm gonna stop talking about it after this. But this stream, for some reason, every graphic I'm putting on the screen is coming out not fully sized and off center, but whatever. The stream is more about the audio anyway. Anyway, this is an article from the Times, and it is humans wipe out 70% of animals in 50 years. That sounds bad. Not to like overly make light of the situation, but that's really bad. Anyway, let's read the article. Humans have wiped out almost 70% of animal populations in almost half a century, conservationists have found. WWF UK said that the decline showed, quote, the lights are flashing red. It warned that the destruction was undermining the fight against climate change. The group's Living Planet report, published every 2 years, is the most comprehensive assessment yet on the decline in wildlife. The study, released today, found that wildlife numbers around the world fell by 69% on average from 1970 to 2018. The decline is the human equivalent of losing all the people in Europe, the Americas, Africa, Oceania, and China. Tanya Steele, the organization's chief executive, said that the bleak conclusions showed the mass destruction of nature. Yeah, I think that would about sum it up. Quote, for us, the biggest concern isn't just the numbers, she said. It's the fact that there is absolutely no action. World leaders are missing in action. The global average masks steeper declines in particular regions. Latin America suffered the biggest fall, with species down 94%, as biodiverse hotspots in the Amazon were bulldozed. This is catastrophic, terrible news. Countries that had already exploited much of their natural environment recorded smaller falls. Numbers were down 20% in North America and 18% in Europe over the period. Freshwater species have been hit harder than those on land. Almost 1,400 species of mammals, fish, amphibians, and other water-dwelling creatures have suffered an 83% fall in numbers on average. The report comes as almost 200 countries are to meet in Canada in December for a UN Biodiversity Summit to agree, on new targets to halt the decline of nature by 2030. None of the targets set for 2020 was met. So that's the thing, whether it's climate change or whatever, they can set all these targets, but then if they're not meeting them, does it mean anything? Are there any consequences? Is there any accountability? Steele said that anything less than a bold deal at the summit would be, quote, an utter betrayal of the next generation. I mean, not to mention the animals. Liz Truss has yet to confirm her attendance at the conference. Steele said it was important that the Prime Minister went to show leadership. The grim figures on wildlife come as the government is being criticized for a perceived, quote, attack on nature with its proposals for investment zones. Steele said that millions of birds had already been lost in Britain. Quote, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. So WWF, World Wildlife Federation or Foundation, I forget, UK said that the loss of animals would threaten action on climate change. Steele said nature is the linchpin in our fight against climate change. Closing out the article, last night, a coalition of conservation groups accused Truss of retracting manifesto pledges on the environment. In an interview with the BBC, Hilary McGrady, Director General of the National Trust, Becky Spite, head of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and Craig Bennett, chief executive of the Wildlife Trusts, said that the lifting of the fracking moratorium, proposed easing of planning rules in, quote, investment zones, review of environmental regulations inherited from the EU, and backtracking on farming reforms were all of concern. Quote, this is the biggest attack on nature certainly in my lifetime, McGrady said. Spite said that there were fears that environmental concerns were being sidelined. Yeah, I think that's safe to say. 70% of life in 50 years. That's, not long before 100%. The environment has become the latest flashpoint for the Prime Minister. The National Trust, usually seen as apolitical, has set out 7 red lines that the government must not cross in its pursuit of growth. Wish I could be more optimistic on the outcome here, but that is not looking good. And again, it's not just the UK. Let's actually go through the chat a bit just to start off here. We're just doing things as they come today, and like the image thing, this is live stream number 52. I've never had this problem with the images before, and I don't even know where the settings are for that. I just haven't had to deal with it. Sorry, I know I said I was going to stop talking about this, but it's anything goes day, really, here at the channel. Have I done an audiobook on the class struggle in France? I have not. I have not. Again, the search function on the channel does work pretty well, or just look up the playlist of the author that you're looking for. Usually that will work too. So, somebody else says, I'm in a small, quote, progressive state where COVID has been, quote, over for months. It's a mystery why the schools have had to close because so many teachers and staff are out sick. Yeah, it's so weird when you, like, declare that the cause of a lot of the stuff happening is just off limits for discussion. Then suddenly you can't explain any of the observed effects. So, yeah. Well, Petunia, I'm reminding you, get vaccinated, get the booster shot. And somebody else was asking in yesterday's stream, they didn't know when to get the booster. So actually, let's go back to that. It said, I got COVID a few weeks ago in early September when my brother went to a wedding. I've been extremely protective when it comes to COVID, and I go out with the N95 mask if I ever do go out. And I got both my vaccine and booster. Question, when should I get this new booster? Should I get it in October when I plan on getting my flu shot? So you're going to want to double check this, but from what I read, and I linked this in the community posts, I think last weekend, like fairly recently, I did a whole thing about COVID. But basically, from the sources that I was reading, it used to be that they were suggesting waiting 3 months after an infection because that infection would give you some temporary immunity. However, the reality is that people are getting infected as soon as a month after infection, sometimes 3 weeks or something. So, this isn't like 2020 where if you got infected, you would have the temporary natural immunity for like 8 to 10 months. Now, with the Omicron strains, which we have allowed to mutate into existence because we've been just spreading and spreading and spreading COVID, and every time it replicates, there's a chance of mutation, and eventually it's going to acquire mutations that give it an advantage. Anyway, now we're into the Omicron world. Things are much, much, much worse now, and the virus is reinfecting people after a month. So from what I was reading, it used to be that they were recommending getting the booster 3 months after, 90 days after an infection. Now they're just saying like a month. So double check that, but that is the last thing that I read. So let's see what else we had for COVID. Somebody gave a potentially interesting article about COVID. I'll make a note of that. I'm not going to have time to read it right now, but I'll check it out later. Thank you for that. And somebody was asking, I've never seen, this is not related to COVID, I've never seen someone call themselves Hoxhaist. Is that a thing outside of Albania? How is it different from anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism? So, Hoxhaism is basically, the lineage here is obviously there was the Soviet Union, there was Marxism-Leninism. Lenin made significant contributions to Marxism, and so they named the ideology of the Soviet Union, which was of course heavily based on Lenin's writings and policies and all that stuff. They named it after him, so it was Marxism-Leninism. Then, of course, after the Chinese Revolution, there are a lot of Chinese communists, including Mao, making contributions to revolutionary theory and practice as well. And in the 50s, after Stalin passed on, there was a split. There was the Sino-Soviet split in the late 50s going into the 60s. And Hoxha, Enver Hoxha, the leader of Albania, was pretty diehard, Marxist-Leninist, really liked the way that the Stalin Soviet Union did things. And they sided with China against Khrushchev, calling, Khrushchev's new policies and de-Stalinization revisionist. But then Hoxha criticized Mao's later policies in the 60s. So then Hoxhaism was like, anti-Khrushchev Maoism, but then it also diverged from Maoist thought as well. So that's Hojaism. They don't like Mao. It's like they like Stalin and they don't like Mao. That's basically it. I mean, and of course, Hoja wrote a lot himself, so I don't mean to say it's just about Stalin. But that is sort of the reference point, as well as the writings of Hoja himself. And believe me, he wrote some very long books. I tend to like Hoja's writing a lot. I think that the bottom line that we all have to face is that all of these projects, the USSR, China, Albania, Yugoslavia, like all these different factions that, had these major ideological rifts with each other, suffered a very similar fate around the same time. It wasn't identical in every case, but as we got into the late 80s, global communism kind of crashed in many ways. So, it kind of makes you look back on. There are many causes for why that happened, but to a certain extent, it's they somewhat met a very similar fate. All right, what else do we have? So, am I covering the COVID news from Florida? We were talking about this before we started recording. The Surgeon General of Florida said that males 18 to 39 should not get mRNA vaccines, alleging an 84% increase in fatal cardiac events in the month following vaccination. I haven't been able to find a study saying that at all. What the fuck is Florida doing? So, yeah. Oh, also somebody asked, how come no VODs? I don't have clips enabled on Twitch. What I do is record the whole thing and then post it onto YouTube. So go to the YouTube channel. All right, that was the end of yesterday's chat. So there's a PolitiFact article on the Florida thing. It's titled, I don't have screenshots, but why an analysis of COVID-19 vaccines from Florida's Surgeon General is flawed. I'm just going to read through this quickly. So this is by Gabrielle Settles. It's from today, the 13th. If you're a male Floridian between the ages of 18 and 39, recent news about the COVID-19 vaccines might have been alarming. Florida Surgeon General Dr. Joseph Ladapo and the state's Department of Health released new guidance recommending against the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines for that demographic, which, by the way, that is most of the vaccines that we have here. However, there are other countries that have COVID vaccines that are not the mRNA variety. The safety data are very similar, though. So the mRNA do not stand out, from what I have seen, as particularly dangerous, whether it's the myocarditis, whatever it is. The stats that I saw were like, on the myocarditis, it was like 6 in 100,000. So, very unusual. Your risk of COVID is much greater than your risk from the vaccine, in other words. So, this is another plank of the anti-vax movement. Is like, oh, well, it's the mRNA things. Well, it's not that actually different from some of the other ones. And then some of the data on, for example, the Sinopharm, the Chinese vaccine, it's not as effective. And, that's not to like single out China or anything like that. But the point is the mRNA vaccines are not any worse, really. But very ignorant people will make out this big thing about it. If you have real data to the contrary, let me know. But I did do some research on this subject, and that was what I came up with. So anyway, they said that there was an 84% increase in cardiac-related deaths for vaccinated men in that age group. That's, anyway, quote, if it had been known 2 years or so ago that this vaccine would increase cardiac deaths in young men by 84%, would they have approved it? The obvious answer is no, Ladapo said. Oh, of course, during an October 10 interview on Tucker Carlson Tonight, which, again, if Nazi Germany had had cable news, that's roughly, I think, what it would have looked like. Quote, you would never give something to someone who is young and healthy and increase their risk of dying from sudden cardiac death by 84%. But doctors and epidemiologists pushed back, saying that the analysis that the recommendation is based on is flawed. So in the back and forth, what should you know about the analysis and recommendation? So this is PolitiFact. We found that the data in the study is limited and does not paint a clear picture. The study wasn't peer-reviewed or published in a scientific journal, which means its accuracy wasn't measured by other scholars. And the new recommendation ignores important context about the vaccine's safety record. Dr. Daniel Salmon, a vaccinologist and director of the Institute for Vaccine Safety at Johns Hopkins, said that the study's conclusions may sound scary, but they don't mean much. Quote, "Firstly, if they did a good study, they should write it up appropriately with sufficient detail. They didn't do that. So posting a report with insufficient detail, flawed data, that didn't consider the vaccine benefits, and then taking this 84% and making a big deal out of it, and then saying that young men shouldn't get vaccinated, it's really irresponsible." The objective of the health department's analysis was, quote, "to evaluate the risks of all-cause and cardiac-related mortality following COVID-19 vaccination. Far less attention has been paid to safety, and the concerns of many individuals have been missed," Ladapo said when the analysis was released on October 7. These are important findings, etc., etc. The study examined the death certificates of patients who died within a 25-week period after COVID-19 vaccination. But doctors pointed out the number of deaths within the demographic in question was tiny. The results from males age 18 to 39 who received an mRNA vaccine included a grand total of 20 deaths during the risk period. Dr. Christine Pantagani wrote in her medical blog, You Can Know Things, quote, "If even just a few of those have another cause, which is highly likely, then they lose statistical significance." So statistical significance is important. It means that the results were not likely to have been caused at random. So that's key. Pantagani is an emergency medicine resident at Yale who wrote extensively about the Florida analysis on her Twitter and blog. And another doctor said, "We're talking about a very small number of deaths. An extra death or two would potentially change these results." And anyway, so the article goes on. There's another doctor quoted, "Who does a study where you look at the effects 25 weeks later? I mean, if you're causing an immune response to your heart, that all happens within a week or 10 days. So you should know about that immediately if there's a dramatic reaction to your heart." Yeah, so it also was, I mean, preprints exist and are evaluated sometimes, but this was not peer-reviewed or published. The authors of the study are anonymous. Oh, well, they should put that up front. I wouldn't have wasted my time reading all this. So, quoting Dr. David Gorski, "The authors of the study are anonymous. Its funding source is not disclosed. Its method section is opaque, and it makes it hard to figure out exactly how the analysis is done." So this is key for replicability. In science, you need to publish your methods so that they can be evaluated and possibly replicated. Now, the nature of science and funding and everything is that studies rarely do get replicated, at least exactly. People will definitely read studies, and then they will base their research off of other people's studies, maybe replicating part of it, but then changing other parts of it. But studies do rarely get reproduced, so sometimes we don't always know if somebody else were to reproduce the same experiment using the same methods, would they get the same results? So, is there reliability there in the findings? So that's key. That's crazy. So it's anonymous, its funding isn't disclosed, and its methods are opaque. Well, yeah, all right. I think we've read enough about that. That's not a credible study. And again, it's not to say that, well, it's not to say anything. They just made a claim, and there's not solid evidence behind it. So come up with some evidence, and then we'll go with that. All right. Will I cover the Schiller-LaRouche conference on October 15? I don't know that there's a point. The only thing I would add to that, we've mentioned how Pat Socks like Jackson Hinkle and Infracell are now fully a part of the Lyndon LaRouche sphere, which is fighting the left from within the left. That was Lyndon LaRouche's approach to organizing. Jimmy Dore has now joined that. Jimmy Dore is going to be at that October 15 LaRouche conference. So they've gone all the way with that. Jimmy Dore has. I guess that promoting Georgia Maloney, as we covered in a couple of live streams back, that was maybe too indirect for him. He needs something a bit more hands-on and tangible. So he's going to the LaRouche conference. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. LaRoucheism making a comeback in 2022. Just, again, didn't have it on the bingo card. Was not expecting that. Could we get some audiobooks from Anna Louise Strong? I'll look into it. Any particular suggestions? Ukraine looks more and more like a forever war. I really wonder what the end will look like. I mean, we know USA liberals love that war because they're able to finally point to some other country starting wars and invasions that take some of the spotlight off of the United States, imperialist crimes for once. But the rest of it, I don't know. I go on Twitter to read news and to, maybe get story ideas and things like that. But I try not to spend more than a couple of nights a week on there because it's fucking deranged. And there's certain just usual suspects who are on there all the time. And it's just like, log off. I remembered fully last night why I took a break for a week. Jesus. But yeah, anyway, the Ukraine war is a common topic. Like, okay, you're really, fighting the good fight, like just angrily tweeting at people like 30 tweets down about the Ukraine war. Just, I don't know, at least get paid for that. Like, it's, I don't know. I think we're just looking at the breakdown of U.S. society at this point. The amount of time people spend online, it's crazy. But anyway, the Ukraine thing, I don't even know what to say anymore. I mean, we've covered statements on it in the past. Actually, there was another one from In Defense of Communism, idcommunism.com. Where did that go? Here it is. So this is there's a statement from Tuesday, October 11. You can look this up. I don't have a screenshot, but it's RKSMB, statement on the entry of Donbas, Kherson, and Zaporozhye into Russia. And so this is the Revolutionary Communist Youth League of Russia Bolsheviks. And they were quoted as saying, "People have made their choice, an unambiguous choice. Today we are signing treaties on the admission of the Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk People's Republic, the Kherson region, and the Zaporozhye region into the Russian Federation." President Vladimir Putin said during the ceremony of the region's accession to Russia on September 30. So this is now the statement from the Revolutionary Communist Youth League Bolsheviks. The Lugansk and Donetsk republics, LPR and DPR, proclaimed their independence from Ukraine on May 12, 2014, during the armed conflict in Donbas, eastern Ukraine, or formerly, depending on what happens here, following the seizure of the Crimean Peninsula by special units of the Russian army. On the same day, the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic asked the Russian authorities to consider the possibility of the DPR becoming part of the Russian Federation. Later, a joint statement by representatives of the republics, Denis Pushilin and Vladislav Denego, said the DPR and LPR unconditionally consider Crimea to be part of Russia. Moreover, our republics would also like to become part of the Russian Federation in an ideal scenario, unquote. Whereas at the beginning of the armed conflict in Donbas, the newly formed republics were in reality the result of the will of the people. However, after a while, the tide of people's demands for justice crashed, not least due to influence of Russian state agencies. Shortly thereafter, the social justice-oriented resistance commanders in Donbas were assassinated under mysterious circumstances. These included Alexei Mozgovoy. No, I messed that up. All right. Sorry. Alexei Mozgovoy, Pavel Dremov, and Arsen Pavlov, also known as Motorola. At the same time, instead of protecting the newly formed republics, Russia took no action during the 8 years of conflict in southeastern Ukraine, except for the low-intensity support of the people's units with humanitarian aid, weapons, and ammunition. Gradually, the pro-people nature of the republics faded away. Positions in the DPR and LPR were occupied by pro-Russian officials and representatives of the region's large bourgeoisie. In 8 years of bloodshed, the Russian government has achieved a weakening of socialist sentiment in the Donbas. The once, quote, people's republics had given up. Russia became the only factor protecting the republics from invasion by the Ukrainian army and repression by its armed forces and the security service. Thus, the, quote, people's republics of the DPR and LPR, which emerged in 2014 on the wave of the rise of miners and tractor drivers, by 2022 had turned into puppets of the Russian Federation, a shock fist of Russian imperialism in Ukraine. In the republics alone, political freedoms have been curtailed, the economic situation is disastrous, and people on the streets are being grabbed into militias by mobilization. At the same time, local pro-Russian oligarchs continue to enjoy a life of leisure, and their incomes and fortunes continue to grow. The special military operation in Ukraine, SMO, or invasion as many others know it, began on February 24, 2022, 2 days after Russia officially recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Russian state, under the pretext of protecting the people's interests of the inhabitants of Donbas, unleashed an imperialist war in which Russia, supported by China, the largest imperialist of the Asia-Pacific region on one side, and the NATO bloc on the other, clashed. Ukraine became the staging ground for the promotion of the interests of the bourgeois groups. On September 30, there was an official ceremony of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye regions. Sorry, I'm not great with the pronunciation there. Joining the Russian Federation as its administrative units. The political decision was made on the basis of referendums held shortly before. The purpose of the referendums was to protect Russia's imperialist interests in the region. There are no honest referendums under capitalism, just like there are no honest elections. The Russian government traitorously condemned the inhabitants of the DPR and LPR to 8 years of suffering and the horrors of war in order to seize these regions as prey at the right moment, catching on to the situation. And while the openly pro-Russian sentiments of the population of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics have been evident since the early 1990s, the residents of the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions of Ukraine found themselves facing a choice in which both are worse. The referendums took place in a situation of control of the territories by Russian armed forces under conditions of continuing hostilities. We cannot consider the free will of a population forced to hide in basements from bombardments, living at gunpoint under the weight of the army boot. The opinion of citizens living outside the actually controlled territory of the DPR and LPR was not taken into account at all, since a significant part of these territories is occupied by the Ukrainian armed forces. There is no doubt that with regard to these regions of Ukraine, the Russian Federation has committed annexation, the seizure of territory for vested interests. Skipping ahead to the end, I'm skipping a little bit here, but in the future, different outcomes are possible. One way or another, the actions of the Russian authorities will lead to an escalation of the conflict, which means new burdens and hardships and new bleeding for the workers. If the current political regimes and economic system persist, any outcome of the war will be a defeat for the working class. A continuation of the war itself would bring new victims and devastation to the workers. The crisis can only be overcome by socialist revolution and the overthrow of capitalist domination. Only by taking power into its own hands may the working class organize the defense of its homeland, take care of civilians and refugees, and recover the economy of the country. Only by overthrowing the domination of their own and the overseas capitalists are the people of the two countries able to agree with each other on peace and friendship. RKSM appeals to all communist and youth organizations of foreign countries. Do not believe that bourgeois Russia is fighting NATO imperialism. We are facing a battle of two imperialisms, the old mature one and the young audacious one. Between them, you cannot choose. You cannot guess which one of them is, quote, better. Both are worse. And both, in their greedy rampage, are putting the planet on the threat of a new world war. No support for NATO and Russian imperialism. Down with the puppets of capital, leading their countries and peoples to ruin. So yeah, when people get caught up in the kind of like head-twisting, revisionist, campist kind of stuff, they abandon most talk of class struggle generally, and I think that that's, once you see people no longer really mentioning class, that they've strayed pretty far from communism. But anyway, I'll probably put that up on the community post and stuff too. It's just that you get into this really binary thinking. A lot of these people do, like the people that are just kind of driving me nuts on Twitter, where it's just this really binary thinking. If you don't think that Russia is, quote, anti-imperialist, then you're a, quote, NATO simp. And then they'll accuse you of not being dialectical or something. And it's like, you're using black and white binary logic for this inter-imperialist conflict, but you're accusing me of like not having, a grasp on dialectics. It's just amazing. How about coming back to class struggle? Consider that. Good comments on the extinction thing, Health Revolt. I have a tally estimate of Russia's losses so far in Ukraine. I'll check that out. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. Ukraine claims this and Russia claims that. There's a war going on. Everybody's lying. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. Communist countries cannot coexist with capitalism for long. We need to take our lessons and go for global communism. Yes, I mean, we saw clearly there was a rising tide in the mid 20th century of, or the early up to the mid 20th century, and then it got beaten back, and it's still in decline. And obviously, we want to see that come back, and that's why we're doing these educational efforts. But just settling for kind of gross revisionism, it's not going to cut it. That's not going to get you what you want. How do we build a mass working class movement without it turning into sellout reformism like CPUSA in the 1930s? I mean, study the history of how that happened and oppose it at every turn vigorously. Seize the leadership and prevent those positions from being adopted. CPUSA's leadership right now, I mean, you go through their website, the stuff that they're publishing, there's some okay stuff, and then there's some very much not okay stuff. I mean, and then, speaking of Twitter, the mental gymnastics that people pull as far as well, that's just the website. Yeah. And it's one of their main, propaganda outlets. That's where they're publishing their articles. If it's just amazing. Again, when you get into revisionism, the kind of mental gymnastics it brings out, if you're having to do tons of mental gymnastics, you're probably going down a revisionist path because you're seeking rationalizations and justifications and twisting the logic to suit your argument rather than coming up with a correct position in the first place. Anyway, not to go on the whole CPUSA thing. Again, as usual, every rank and file CPUSA, and I know many listen to this channel, are good people. Most of you don't get why the National does all the dem-tailing and everything because nobody in your locals is for that. I guess my question at that point is just, why do you have national leadership if it's completely disconnected with the opinions of everybody in the locals? Which I'm not saying that you're wrong. I think that, most of the rank and file CPUSA people that I have talked to don't approve of a lot of the revisionist stuff. So why is the leadership still revisionist? That's the question. Yeah, you have a good point, Whoopsie, on that's a very specific demographic to single out not taking the vaccine, the 20 to 40 men in Florida. And yeah, there's probably a very specific political demographic reason for that heading into the election, trying to court certain supporters. Anonymous authors, any reason to think that this isn't a GOP op at this point, and undisclosed funding to top it off? Yeah, I mean, probably the fucking guy wrote it himself. Russia has worked with far-right Ukrainians to dox and kill communists in Donbas prior to 2022. I have zero stake in this conflict because there is no proletarian side. Strikes are banned as well. Yeah, so, I mean, Russia's interested in decommunization. They haven't done it by the exact same route that the Ukraine has, but Putin has offered, quote, full decommunization to Ukraine, which would basically mean absorbing Ukraine back into Russia like prior to the revolutionary period. This is accurate. There was a sort of low-key coup in the Donbas once Russia got more influence there. By 2016, the communist parties were barred from elections. At the start, they were led by socialists, though, especially Donetsk. But this is the problem of like people not being able to ever update to like new information, and then people just run with the name of something, and then they can't understand new conditions at all or new turns of events. Yeah, I too have seen Russia defended by so-called Marxists because they say that U.S. imperialism is the primary contradiction. You're doing it wrong. To people doing that, you're doing it wrong. Oh yeah, well if we just defeat U.S. hegemony, like basically it's going to automatically lead to proletarian revolutions. No, Russia and China and that bloc are going to move into those areas. And when was the last time that they were promoting revolutionary activity? So I think that that's dubious, Mao called it cutting the foot to fit the shoe. They have a position and work backwards to justify it. Isn't imperialism as a whole the primary contradiction? Hey, that's dangerous. Don't talk like that. But no, you see, it's just you got to single out one imperialist side. That's how the dominant logic is going. Again, there's just so much work that has to be done for... I don't know. All right, let's get back into the COVID stuff. So, BioBot, after not updating itself for a while, did update itself again. So that's nice of them to do that. So, where are we at in the week of October 12? We are at, so you can see the peak there of back in July, August when BA4, BA5 hit. That was the biggest peak by far outside of the Omicron spike. It has since come down, and then there was a little wave again. It's come down again, but we're starting another wave, as you can see that it is curving up. Let us go to the close-up of the regions from the last 6 months so we can take a better look at the plateau that we've been in for the last 6 months. So you can see there, stupid graphics, really would love, I never would have closed the image thing if it wasn't for this. All right, anyway, or if I'd known this was going to happen. So that orange line, as you can see on the map, that's the Northeast where COVID is going up, up, up. And this is wastewater. It's not cases. It's how much virus is actually making it into the wastewater, excreted from people's bodies, detected in the wastewater. This is one of the most reliable things that we can do. It's also very timely. It shows up not long after the stuff goes into the wastewater. So you can see the other three regions are kind of plateauing around 450 or so, which is still a significant amount of COVID in the water. The Northeast, which of course gets cold pretty early, and that may be driving this, going up, up, up. It's about at 1,300 copies of the virus per milliliter of sewage. That's a lot. That's a really concerning amount. So the Northeast is going up, and this is also happening in Europe. There was a chart I don't have a copy of from Germany, but that same deal. It's going up sharply, actually much more sharply than that. So COVID is definitely not over, despite all the pronouncements from Joe Biden and whatever else. And the other three areas of the U.S. are, not currently in that pattern that the Northeast is, but you can expect those to follow suit. They're kind of leveling out, and I think that they're likely to start ticking up soon. You can see the pink, which is the Southeast, basically Florida to Texas to West Virginia. Looks like it's gently starting to trend up. Too soon to say, though. All right, so that's the overall state of things with COVID. Let's take a look at, I've got a bunch of little short things. Let's start off, though, with this article about XBB, the new immune-evasive COVID strain that combines COVID variants is driving cases in 2 countries. This is by Nicholas Gordon from Tuesday. And of course, all of the strains now are more immune-evasive than ever, so that's a bit redundant. But anyway, experts are studying the rise of variants like XBB, which combine multiple COVID strains. So that's recombination. The virus can mix and match genetic material if you catch more than one strain in your body at the same time. And yeah. Anyway, it combines multiple COVID strains and driving cases in countries such as Singapore. New variants of the rapidly mutating coronavirus are still popping up around the world, and a new iteration of COVID on the rise in Asia may be the most immune-evasive yet, the XBB strain. And just to clarify, XBB is one of like a dozen strains that are emerging right now. One of the things we're going to look at next is what Eric Feigelding is calling the Pentagon model, because there are 5 major strains of COVID that are surging right now in the U.S. that are part of the emerging surge. So we got 5 strains that are contributing to the surge right now, and there are even more strains around the world that are active, just to keep that in mind. Anyway, the XBB strain is causing a small surge in cases in countries like Bangladesh and Singapore. The latter has recorded a daily average of about 5,500 cases over the past week, compared to a daily average of 2,000 cases a month ago. So nearly 3 times as many. Officials in Singapore, which is scaling back its last remaining COVID restrictions to reopen to the rest of the world, bad timing, are not yet concerned about the increase in cases. Why? Do you think it's going to go away on its own? On Monday, Health Minister Ong Ye-kung noted that only 15% of the country's recent COVID cases were reinfections. Quote, "If you start to see 50% getting it a second time, you're going to have a wave," he said. I mean, if you're opening up in these circumstances, how long before that happens? Is it likely that that's going to happen? Yes. The health ministry did start doling out Moderna's Omicron booster on Tuesday, 3 days ahead of schedule, citing rising infections caused by the new XBB Omicron subvariant. We need to give these things their own names and stop calling them Omicron. They are derived from Omicron, but they're, we need new letters for these things. Hospitalizations in Singapore have increased alongside the rise in cases, yet deaths remain low. Okay, but death is not really the only outcome you need to worry about here at all. There's brain damage, immune system damage, all kinds of things. With fewer than a dozen recorded in the country over the past week, over 90% of Singapore's population has received 2 doses of a COVID vaccine, and 79% have received at least 1 booster. Bangladesh is also reporting a small uptick in cases, though reported numbers are smaller than Singapore's. The South Asian country reported a daily average of about 500 cases during the week of October 3rd, compared to an average of 300 cases a month earlier. Bangladesh has a vaccination rate of 75.5%. On Monday, Hong Kong's health authorities said that they found the city's first case of XBB.1, a subvariant of the XBB strain, in an imported case from the U.S. Officials said that the positive case showed no symptoms. No symptoms is not really, it can still spread and it can still cause damage. That's one of the articles I'm most fond of sharing, is the even mild or asymptomatic COVID can cause brain shrinkage and brain aging equivalent to a decade of natural aging. So, no symptoms as far as the acute sort of lung shutdown that can cause sudden death, in the first few weeks, fine, but that's just one small portion of the harm that COVID causes. Immune-evasive. Experts are paying close attention to the XBB strain, which combines 2 different Omicron strains. Eric Topol, founder of the Scripps Research Translational Institute, tweeted that XBB is one of the most important variants to watch right now. It has a substantial growth advantage over BA5. XBB and BQ11 are 2 of the most important variants on watch right now. I'm telling you now, we're going to lose track of all these variants because we're going to have like a dozen variants going at the same time. The new strain is probably the most immune-evasive yet. I mean, all of them are. Like, everyone is more than, it's like 25% more immune-evasive and contagious than the last. This is just how it's going. It's just a matter of time before there's either a quantum leap towards something much worse, or it just, gradually upticks to something where we can no longer control it. Already we've covered before how for BA 2.752, there's only one approved monoclonal antibody that can, do anything with it. So we're going to get to the point where nothing can treat these things. Our own immune system or the monoclonal antibodies. It's bad. Anyway, the new strain is probably the most immune evasive yet due to its combination of mutations from other strains. Pronunciation is just not working for me today. I don't know what it is. Rajnarayanan, a professor at the New York Institute of Technology's Jonesboro, Arkansas campus, told Fortune in September. A preprint study from October 4, authored by researchers at Peking University and Chongqing Laboratory, found that XBB had the greatest ability to evade antibody protections among newly emerging variants. Experts are also concerned that monoclonal antibody treatments might be less effective against newer variants like XBB and BA.2.752. Quote, "We haven't seen this type of immune evasion before," Michael Osterholm, director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, told Fortune earlier this month. Last slide. BA.5 is still the most dominant strain of COVID in the U.S., making up 79.2% of COVID cases recorded between October 2 and October 11, according to the Centers for Disease, their thing, the Nowcast. But other variants are starting to catch up. Over the past week, 13.6% of cases were from the BA.4.6 subvariant, an increase of 6.4% of cases 2 months ago. The BF7 strain is also spreading quickly, making up 4.6% of cases today, compared to just 0.3% 2 months ago. In order to keep ahead of the rapidly mutating coronavirus, the U.S. approved bivalent boosters targeting BA4 and BA5 on August 31st, yet only 7.6 million Americans have received the Omicron booster since it became widely available on Labor Day. A survey from the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 2/3 of Americans are either putting off getting the new booster or saying that they're not going to get it at all. So that's the end of that article. And to be honest, I haven't gotten the booster yet. I am waiting because of my circumstances a little bit closer to November. So I plan to get it in a few weeks because I need the protection through December and January to be like at its peak. And that's me. For most people, you probably just want to get it right away. But yeah, they put us in a horrible situation where you get the shot and it only lasts a few months. And yes, it takes the edge off of the infection, but I don't want to get infected at all. And if I do get infected, I need it to be at the absolute peak of the vaccine coverage, which unfortunately is somewhat fleeting. It's not a good thing. We need transmission control, and we need it now. So I mentioned the Pentagon model. Let's look at that right away. Again, nothing to do with like the U.S. Pentagon. It's because there were 5 strains considered in it, which are surging currently. So this is from Eric Feigl Ding and another epidemiologist that he works with, Dr. Eric Ding on Twitter. Case projections for the United States. You can see the peak there coming down on the left side of the chart from August 15. That was roughly the time of the peak, just coming down from the peak of about 120,000 cases per day. Remember that about 15 to 20% of those are going to come down with long COVID. So that's a substantial amount of people. You're talking about, 20,000 people a day getting long COVID a day. That's not good. We're going to cover what long COVID is all about again. We've covered it many times. We're going to cover it again in today's stream. But you can see the red line there, BA5. And then the blue curve is the overall curve, like all of the strains put together, all of the cases put together. That's the overall blue curve. So BA5 has been in decline for a while, and it's getting supplanted by other strains which are out competing it. That's represented by the green line, or what they're calling Pentagon. That is like 5 surging strains all put together. So this is what it's looking like, that the curve is going to go up sharply in early to mid-November. And then, so basically, it starts really taking off the week of 11/7. And then by 11/21, it's just shooting through the roof. So basically, around, mid-month, November 15th, expect to see this thing skyrocketing. That's based on their projections for the what they're calling the Pentagon collection of strains. So that is what is in store according to those epidemiologists. All right, let's go through a bunch of other stuff. I really have a grab bag of COVID stuff today. Here is a little tidbit. This is from Nature Reviews Immunology. And they sometimes publish these things that aren't full studies, but they're just little abstracts. And I have 3 of these. So this first one, vaccines only partially protect against long COVID. So we've covered this before in articles from William Hazeltine at Forbes, who's a good writer on COVID sciencey stuff and taking it seriously and all that kind of thing. Basically, if you're unvaccinated completely, the risk of long COVID is, according to an Italian study, about 40%. And this can change from strain to strain. Again, this is a novel virus. We don't have long-term data on it because it's novel. We haven't encountered this thing before because it didn't exist before in the human population at all. We didn't know of it before. But from what we do know, that Italian study said if you're completely unvaccinated, like you didn't even get your primary, 40% risk. If you get 1 shot of your primary, which of course most of the things you need 2 shots, that cuts your risk down to like 30%. If you get both shots of the primary series, then you get your COVID risk cut down to like 20 or like upper teens percent. And then if you get your booster, it only cuts it down a few more percentage points. So you get down to about 16, 17% risk of long COVID. So that's 1 in 6. Those are bad odds, okay? That's like, take a regular 6-sided die, roll it. If you roll a 6, you're done. And you got long COVID. So that's pretty bad odds. And that's even if you're fully vaccinated with a booster. Again, this could change. That was a study out of Italy on some of the strains that they knew of up to that time. It could be different now with Omicron. It could be different now with the strain that's emerging today that you've never heard of yet. And nobody's heard of yet because it's recombining in some person's body in Nebraska and then it just hasn't spread yet. But this is how it goes, and we're just rolling the dice constantly. But anyway, vaccines only partially protect against long COVID. I mean, the takeaway here, should you still get them? Yes. But understand you're not fully protected against long COVID. It does not bring your odds down to 0. It brings them down to about 1 in 6. COVID-19 vaccines have proven very successful in protecting against severe disease. However, they only provide partial protection against infection, and an increasing number of individuals suffer breakthrough infections, BTIs, after vaccination. So if you have the vaccine, you can still get infected. It is going to reduce your symptoms and your odds of getting the worst outcomes. But even the people getting breakthrough cases where the symptoms are significant, that number is increasing. So the virus is mutating around this stuff. Again, we need transmission control. It's the only thing that's actually going to stop it. Anyway, Al-Ali and colleagues investigated the vast U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs National Healthcare Database to determine the level of protection that vaccines provide against post-acute COVID-19 sequelae or long COVID. So what does that mean? Post-acute means after that first 3-week or 4-week period, the acute phase of COVID. That's where people are likely to land in the hospital if they're going to, etc. But then after that acute phase, within that first month, you can get sequelae. So that's consequences, basically, of the infection, long-term effects. So that's long COVID. It's sometimes called PACS, post-acute COVID-19 sequelae. Anyway, they found that individuals with breakthrough infections compared with unvaccinated individuals had a lower risk of death and long COVID between 1 to 6 months post-infection, particularly when comparing patients who had been hospitalized with COVID-19. However, the overall protection of the vaccine from long COVID was only about 15%. So this is bearing out that Italian study I was talking about, which means that the burden of long COVID is likely to be substantial even in fully vaccinated populations. Therefore, vaccination alone may not be, you think it may not be enough? Yeah, I would say it definitely is not enough to mitigate the long-term health consequences of SARS coronavirus 2 infection. So in the vaccinated people, it was about 15%. When you add in the portions of the population who are not vaccinated, that's going to bring you again to about 20%. It's a nice round number, about 20%. So all of the cases that you're seeing per day, and again, the case count is a dramatic undercount because they're not really, a lot of people are just doing rapid tests. Those don't get reported and they don't get counted. So when we see 120,000 cases a day and you take 20% of that, then maybe double or triple the number because that's what's actually happening, but just isn't getting reported. So again, the main thing that the government seemed to be interested in is that acute period, hospitalizations and deaths. But the effects of long COVID, they go on far, far beyond that. Actually, let's go right into this now. You know what? Actually, I was going to do this article and then I read through it and I think it was maybe not particularly on point. It was a lot about this doctor's feelings and things. So I'm actually going to skip that particular article. All right, this is a better one though. Strokes, heart attacks, sudden deaths. Does America understand the long-term risks of catching COVID? This is in Fortune by Carolyn Barber. And there in the picture, Arizona Cardinals defensive end J.J. Watt recently disclosed that he had an episode of atrial fibrillation. So that's where in your heart, you have a couple of nodes, electrical nodes, that keep your heart beating, the different chambers of your heart beating in the proper order. I mean, I say beating, contracting. That's what causes your heartbeat, is the different regions of your heart, they contract in a particular order, and this is controlled by the brainstem in part, but also there are electrical little centers in your heart called nodes that they regulate your heartbeat. If those get damaged, your heart can start beating out of order. You can fibrillate, which is sort of disorganized electrical activity that does not result in the smooth wave of the heartbeat, functioning as intended, that actually pumps your blood and therefore keeps you alive. So that's why, when they shock people with the paddles, that's defibrillation. You're trying to get people out of fibrillation. You're trying to shock the heart to restore order to that wave of electrical activity that causes a smooth and orderly heartbeat. While the condition can be caused by a number of reasons, Watt was diagnosed with COVID in the weeks leading up to his health crisis. So again, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. In this case, we know that COVID can do this, so it's entirely possible and worth investigating. A 35-year-old acquaintance drops dead from a hemorrhagic stroke. A friend in her 30s and another in his 70s experience recurrent spells of extreme dizziness, their hearts pounding in their chests when they stand. A 21-year-old student with no prior medical history is admitted to the ICU with heart failure, while a 48-year-old avid tennis player, previously healthy, suddenly suffers a heart attack. A relative is diagnosed with pericarditis, an inflammation of the protective sac surrounding the heart. I can't confirm the exact etiology of all these cases, but every one of the people I mentioned had a history of COVID either days or months beforehand, and all of them experienced only mild cases of infection at the time. Is it possible, despite everything we know, that we still underestimate COVID's reach and danger? Time out. So people who do the science on this, nobody's underestimating it. It's we're not being listened to, we're not being amplified, etc. It is not normal for me to know so many people with severe conditions. Not normal at all. Lengthy social media threads have begun compiling lists of people much like those mentioned above. And while there are many possible causes for their health misfortunes, the sheer volume of cases speaks to something more worrisome than just a Twitter phenomenon. A large international study involving 136 research institutions in 32 countries has documented an increased incidence of ischemic strokes in young patients compared to pre-pandemic levels. More than a third were under the age of 55, and many lacked typical risk factors such as smoking, diabetes, and high blood pressure. Is COVID the reason? In a study that included patients from the initial wave of the pandemic, scientists from the University of Florida found that survivors of severe COVID-19 had 2.5 times the risk of dying in the year following illness compared to people who were never infected. So again, death just during the acute phase is not the only risk here. You can, like, you're more likely to die 2.5 times. If you had severe COVID, you're 2.5 times more likely to die in the year following illness compared to people who had never been infected, according to the study. Of note, nearly 80% of downstream deaths were not due to typical COVID complications like acute respiratory distress or cardiac causes. The results suggest a severe impact of COVID-19 exists beyond the cost and suffering of the initial hospitalization, says Arch Manus, one of the study's authors. How vaccinated patients have fared. In a huge analysis, and so this is the other thing, every time you encounter like anti-vax, COVID denier, COVID minimizer trolls, they're always trying to blame the fucking vaccine for this. No. That just tells me you do not read studies at all, because there are many studies on vaccinated versus unvaccinated populations, and the data just speak for themselves in the same way time and time again. In a huge analysis of more than 30,000 vaccinated patients who had experienced COVID breakthrough infections, pre-Omicron, just to know what strains we're talking about, scientists found that 6 months later, even the vaccinated incurred a higher risk of death and debilitating long COVID symptoms involving multiple organs: lungs, heart, kidney, brain, and others. Gee, that sounds like the list I'm always saying when we talk about COVID-19 stuff. When compared to controls without evidence of SARS coronavirus 2 infection. So they had a higher risk of death and debilitating long COVID symptoms involving multiple major organs when compared to people who there's no evidence that they were infected with the coronavirus. What type of evidence? Probably antibodies, things like that. Even the fittest are not immune. So we've covered this before. There was a politician out in I want to say Oklahoma or somewhere. Anyway, she was in her late 40s, healthy, jogged every day, biked, swam, stuff like that. Got COVID, had to get a pacemaker installed because it just destroyed her heart. Even the fittest are not immune. Researchers have noted a troubling pattern of sudden cardiac death in athletes in the wake of the pandemic, possibly owing to COVID-related heart complications. Myocarditis, that's inflammation of the heart muscle, and pericarditis, that's inflammation of the pericardium surrounding the heart. The Arizona Cardinals football lineman J.J. Watt recently disclosed that he had an episode of atrial fibrillation, and while there are many possible causes of AFib, it's notable that Watt was diagnosed with COVID-19 just about 6 weeks prior. Atrial fibrillation has long been associated with COVID. COVID reinfections. In a non-peer-reviewed study, that's probably a preprint, Ziad Al-Ali from the Washington University School of Medicine and his team analyzed the health records of 38,000 people with COVID reinfections. So this is reinfections now. Compared to individuals with a single infection, researchers found that these reinfected individuals had higher risks of mortality, hospitalization, and adverse health outcomes in multiple organs. So we've covered this before in if you just search on reinfection, I think it'll come up, but it's also in the COVID-19 for Socialists playlist. There was an article, William Hazeltine, again from Forbes, talking about the risk of reinfection. Every time you get reinfected, on average, your risk of just all this serious stuff, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, potentially life-threatening conditions, all this other stuff, strokes, insomnia, anxiety, depression, a whole range of neurological effects, as well as other major organ effects, go up every time that you get reinfected. These risks were present regardless of vaccination status. Every infection added increased risk for both acute and long-term complications. We're still learning how pervasive this all is. An analysis of more than 150,000 COVID-19 survivors published in Nature Medicine found that people with coronavirus are at increased risk of developing neurologic sequelae, including strokes, cognition and memory problems, seizures, movement disorders, and many other issues in the first year after infection. So this is the thing with long COVID. You may have a mild case, you may have a moderate case, you may have a basically asymptomatic case that you're not even aware of. And then 3 months later, you start getting bizarre symptoms that you've never had before. I talked to an S4A commenter who developed seizures, had never had seizures in their life, there's no history of it in their family, etc. But they got COVID, they started getting seizures. Movement disorders and many other issues, yes. The risks of developing these long-term complications were apparent even in people who did not require hospitalization during their initial infection. Quote, the results show the profound long-term consequences of COVID-19, Ali told me. Some of these will scar people for a lifetime. So, somebody needed to get their hair cut, somebody needed to go out to a restaurant, enjoy your fucking heart damage. According to the researchers' estimate, COVID is responsible for more than 40 million new neurologic cases. Let's read that again. According to the researchers' estimate, COVID is responsible for more than 40 million new neurologic cases. Key caveat, study period mostly predated vaccines. However, Ali says, we know that vaccines minimally reduce and do not eliminate long COVID risk. Indeed, a large study found that vaccines were only about 15% effective at preventing long COVID. That's what we were just talking about. And also, people who have severe COVID where they get hospitalized, that will roughly double your odds of long COVID. So asymptomatic, mild, moderate, your odds are basically all the same for getting long COVID or not. But if you get hospitalized, that way ups your odds because the extent of the damage it's done and the extent of the infection and everything, probably also the extent of the immune system damage because COVID can, the coronavirus can directly infect T cells, leading in many people to reduced T cell counts. So anyway, if you get hospitalized, your odds of long COVID go up to 50 to 60%. And then there's other things too, like the older that you are, the more likely you are to get it, but not linearly. There's like certain age groups that are more likely than others. So it does depend on age, it depends on hospitalization status, it depends on, other health statuses. So anyway, basically everybody is at, quote, increased risk. About 80% of the United States is either overweight or obese. That's congrats. You're at increased risk of COVID. Then if you have anything else, asthma, diabetes, like whatever, that's going to up your odds too. Actually, we're going to read about diabetes right after this. No age group is reliably safe. Significantly, the risk of some of the complications is stronger in younger adults. Let's read that again. Significantly, the risk of some of these complications is stronger in younger adults. At the other end of the spectrum, a huge study found that COVID-19 increased the risk of developing Alzheimer's in those 65 and older by 50 to 80%, and that was in people with no previous diagnosis. So again, this goes back to the damage that COVID does to the brain. It is found in the brain. It attacks the brain stem, as well as parts of the brain responsible for memory and cognition and executive function. So that's really serious. And, as we've put up before, it causes brain shrinkage, reductions in overall brain mass, and particularly brain mass in those areas responsible for memory, etc. So yeah, a link to Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia, absolutely. Researchers believe that COVID-19 infection induces a pro-thrombotic and pro-inflammatory state. So a thrombus is a clot, inflammation is inflammation, so pro-thrombotic increases likelihood of clotting, pro-inflammatory increases inflammation, which may increase the risk of blood clots. In a cohort study of 48 million adults in England and Wales just published, COVID-19 was linked with dramatic increases in both arterial clots, these cause strokes and heart attacks, and venous thromboembolism. These are blood clots in the lungs and legs, among other places. So a thrombus is a clot, and if it detaches, it can float through your circulatory system. If it lodges in a place like up around your heart and lungs, you can get a pulmonary embolism. That can be life-threatening, so these are really serious conditions. Clearly, we're still in the clutches of the virus, and some of the outcomes are frightening. A study that included data from over 1 million pediatric patients found that adolescents aged 18 and younger had a 72% increased risk of developing type 1 diabetes in the 6 months following their COVID infection. That risk isn't limited to children, it's also being seen in adults. So, adolescents 18 and younger had a 72% increased risk of developing type 1 diabetes in the 6 months following their COVID infection. So COVID is increasing people's risk of diabetes. It's causing diabetes in people who probably wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. Though they're mentioning type 1 diabetes, we've covered previously, it attacks the pancreas, and it can increase your risk of type 2 diabetes as well, especially in children. A nightmare scenario, a mild COVID case that leads to lifelong diabetes. But rather than continue to beat the drum for caution, most cities, governments, and even the CDC are loosening restrictions when it comes to COVID precautions. Yeah, that is a nightmare. Thank you for calling it that, honestly. America needs to wake up now. A recent Kaiser Family Foundation survey shows that 2/3 of U.S. adults have no intention of getting the updated booster shots anytime soon, yet rampant breakthrough infections and more immune-evading variants are on the horizon. Quote, the degree of immune escape and evasion is amazing right now. Crazy. Yunlong Richard Cao, an immunologist at Peking University in Beijing, told Nature a few days ago. In a preprint, which has not been peer-reviewed, Cao et al. Found that the new subvariants like BQ11, CA1, I haven't even heard of that one, and especially XBB are the most antibody-evasive strains to date. Quote, these results suggest that current herd immunity and BA.5 vaccine boosters may not provide sufficiently broad protection against infection, they wrote. So again, the boosters are valuable to a certain extent. You should get them. I plan to get one as well. But if you get one of the strains that isn't directly related to this and has mutations that really overcome the antibodies, then, you're SOL. I mean, this is the game that we're playing right now, or rather that the capitalists are playing with our lives, because it's really for their businesses that we are keeping all this shit open. In our country, 300 to 400 COVID deaths are already occurring every day. Cases are rising in some European countries such as France, Germany, Italy, and Belgium. Quote, we are clearly at the start of a winter COVID-19 wave, said Karl Lauterbach, Germany's federal minister of health, in a press briefing. Germany has just implemented new rules requiring mask wearing on trains, local buses, as well as in hospitals, nursing homes, and doctors' offices. We're not likely to get that in the U.S. because there's a federal thing going on with that, and there's a whole debacle. We covered it previously, where some Trump-appointed judge, I think in Florida, found some loophole, and they basically constrained the CDC's ability to do anything. Not that the CDC was particularly gung-ho to do anything in the first place. The road ahead is going to be rough until we can develop a variant-proof vaccine. No, you need to stop fucking transmission. It's not even being reduced transmission. No, but they're talking about the vaccine. We'll get to that. It's not even really being considered. We need routine testing in colleges and schools again. We need quarantine and isolation again. We need mask mandates, first of all, again. There's all kinds of things that can be done. And just literally none of them are being done except for the booster shots right now. I mean, we're just pissing it away. These, 80,000 people getting sick a day, times 2 or 3 or whatever it is, most of that does not need to be happening. We don't need to have these, immune-evasive variants. That's entirely a creation of human activity at this point. None of this needs to be happening. None of it. Anyway, until we can develop a variant-proof vaccine, what are you waiting for? Approve nasal vaccines to help block infection at the port of entry and reduce transmission. Yeah, so a lot of people have been talking about the nasal vaccines. I was just reading the other day that they're probably not the magic bullet a lot of people think that they're going to be. Nasal vaccines is basically it's just like it sounds. It is taken intranasally. It's inhaled through the nose. And so you're basically prioritizing the upper respiratory tract to be more resistant, more trained against protecting against COVID. But apparently the data show that they're not really as the magic bullet you would want them to be. They're helpful, but anyway. And develop better treatments. Yeah, because how's the treatment thing going? Well, Paxlovid only works for people really over 65. So if you're not over 65, again, shit out of luck. And again, the main thing is does it reduce hospitalizations and does it reduce deaths? Really, everything else gets discarded. So if you get COVID and it's a mild case and then you die 2 years later, oh well, fuck you. That's basically the way that the COVID response is being run right now. So hey, you just had 25 years shaved off your life. Oh well. Hey, at least people got to get haircuts, right? So anyway. As the virus becomes more immune evasive, our arsenal is shrinking, not expanding, despite what the CDC and political leaders may claim. The monoclonal antibody strategy, for instance, proved ineffective as the virus outsmarted us and kept evolving. An entirely predictable outcome, I might add, rapidly rendering many monoclonal antibody therapies obsolete shortly after they were approved. We have plenty still to understand about long COVID, particularly in the vaccinated population, but Al-Ali estimates that 8 to 12% of vaccinated people with breakthrough infections may develop long COVID, probably higher than that. Around the world, an estimated 145 million people are suffering from the condition, cases of which rose more than 300% in 2021. We need to do a much better job preventing mass infections and reinfections, fast-tracking research, funding new treatments for victims, and developing a coordinated response both nationally and internationally. Producing universal coronavirus and nasal vaccines and drugs to minimize long COVID risk is a top priority. As Al-Ali put it, we need ambitious policies to get ahead of this virus and the pandemic. It's called controlling transmission. It's called testing on a routine basis. It's called having school closings where you need it. It's called we need a transformation of society in order to be able to deal with this. It's not even really being considered here. And also, let's talk for a minute about drugs and treatments. A lot of this stuff, like Paxlovid, is slated in 2023 to be treated like any other drug. So if you don't have health care, or you don't have adequate health care, as many people, tens of millions, don't in the US, guess what? Fuck you. That's the standard US response when it comes to your health. So that's where we're headed next year. As a country, we're clearly tired of masking, boosting. Oh, thank you for at least mentioning masks, by the way. Boosting and COVIDing in general. But as exhausting as this march has already been, we're nowhere near the finish line. We must stop pretending otherwise. So again, some good information in this article. Some conspicuous absences, such as masking, testing, shutdowns. It needs to be done. It needs to be talked about. Anyway, I have a couple more things here, but you know what, actually, I think I can probably finish this up. I don't have too much more. I'm going to do that, then we'll just talk in the chat, and then we'll be done for the stream. So here's another one of those little tidbit articles from Nature Immunology. Diabetes enhances viral loads in COVID-19. Diabetes is linked to enhanced susceptibility to severe COVID-19, but the underlying reasons are not well understood. Here, Garetta et al. Report the development of diabetic-like kidney organoids induced by an oscillatory glucose regimen. Expression of the cell surface receptor ACE2, that's where COVID enters cells, was shown to be essential for infection with SARS coronavirus 2. Diabetic conditions both enhanced cellular expression of ACE2 and induced a switch from oxidative phosphorylation to aerobic glycolysis. Sorry if I'm losing people, we'll summarize at the end, which increased viral loads upon infection of the organoids. Similar observations were made in kidney proximal tubular cells, isolated from patients with diabetes, where altered mitochondrial respiration and enhanced glycolysis correlated with higher viral loads after SARS coronavirus 2 infection. Conversely, treatment of patient kidney cells with an inhibitor of aerobic glycolysis resulted in reduced viral loads upon viral exposure. This demonstrates that diabetes-associated metabolic reprogramming increases susceptibility of kidney cells to SARS coronavirus 2 infection, providing a possible explanation why diabetes can worsen outcome in patients with COVID-19. So the main thing here, and you can see the study this came from down at the bottom, the main thing here, I think, for most people is if you have diabetes, you are more susceptible to severe COVID-19. So they're trying to understand, this was very technical, but they're trying to understand the reasons why. And basically they found that diabetic conditions, I had it and I lost it. Expression of the cell surface receptor ACE2 was shown to be essential for infection with it, and sorry for the dead air. Anyway, I'm not sure how to sum this up exactly. That's not in a super technical way, but what you can take away from this is if you have diabetes, you are more susceptible to severe COVID-19. Moving on to the next thing here. What's this? All right, here's the third and last one. Omicron alone provides limited cross protection. So again, practical implications here. The COVID-19 pandemic has been characterized by multiple waves of infection with different SARS coronavirus 2 variants of concern. The Omicron variant generally causes milder symptoms than other variants of concern, especially in vaccinated individuals. So again, milder symptoms during the acute phase. Long COVID, entirely different story. But anyway. And it is highly transmissible, leading many to wonder whether immunity induced by Omicron may provide for cross-variant protection and bring us closer to the end of the pandemic. So this was the theory kind of originally that, Omicron's going to be a, quote, natural vaccine. In other words, Omicron can be caught more safely. This was the incredibly irresponsible reasoning that was being put out. You can catch Omicron, with less risk. You're less likely to end up in the hospital than you were with Delta or whatever. Therefore, it's, quote, safer to catch. And, well, of course, they're not advising anybody to actually go out and catch it on purpose. No, they wouldn't do that. But, if you do catch it, then maybe this is going to wrap up the pandemic. Well, let's just take a look at something real quick again. Let's look at BioBot again. Does this look to you like Omicron has brought an end to the pandemic? That's not what I see. I see that we had a lump in the spring of 2020, then we had a lump of COVID, big surge in the fall and winter of 2020, and into 2021. Then last fall, we had a kind of early wave. That was Delta. It dipped for a bit, and then going into the late fall, into January, then we got Omicron, which dwarfed everything else. You had, 5,000 copies or so, 4,700 copies of COVID per milliliter of sewage. That comes down, and then what's the aftermath? I mean, it's basically like if you took the 2020, 2021 winter and the Delta waves and combined them all, I'm not even sure that they would equal the last 6 months, the sustained plateau that we've been in for the last 6, 7, 8 months. So does that look over to you? It really doesn't look over to me. It looks actually like it's worse than ever. This is why I said that on my New Year's show, December 31st, 2021, the pandemic may just be beginning. And indeed, here we are. We got 5 surging variants, which are way more transmissible than any of the other stuff. So, however, a report in Nature now shows, now you tell us, that Omicron only induces a limited humoral immune response and little cross-variant neutralization in unvaccinated individuals. By contrast, Omicron breakthrough infections in vaccinated individuals induced high titers of neutralizing antibodies against all variant concerns. This indicates that although Omicron infection acts as a, quote, booster in vaccinated individuals, it provides little protection from other variants of concern in unvaccinated individuals. Again, if you're running with the anti-vax stuff, you're just wrong on basically every count. Couple of other little items here. So this is real quick. I actually wasn't even able to get this whole article. This is from Stat. Merck's COVID-19 pill was no better than placebo in lowering the risk of hospitalization by Ed Silverman. This is from the 7th. So there's a picture of it. Nice, pretty red pills. And a Merck pill used to combat COVID-19 failed to demonstrate that it can lower the risk of hospitalization compared with a placebo among adults at a higher risk from the disease, according to the results of a large study conducted in the UK. The preliminary results of the randomized trial, which involved more than 25,000 participants. So, okay, randomized controlled trial, that's like the gold standard in this kind of research. Of 25,000 participants, that's a great sample size. It showed that molnupiravir did speed time to recovery by about 6 days, which means that the patients did get some relief. Otherwise, though, the study failed to reach an outcome that had been used late last year by regulators, such as those in the US and UK, to authorize the medicine to thwart the pandemic. So it does something. It will reduce duration by about 6 days, but again, risk of hospitalization, No. Is there anything else before we go back to the chat? Just looking here. Yeah, there was a quick thing here. This is the last thing. 3 new symptoms could be a COVID warning sign study as claims study as cases rise in the UK. It's by Jacob Raleigh and Kellyanne Mills. So the findings come as data from Zoe Health Study suggests that 1 in 25 Brits now have coronavirus. And a link has been found between COVID and dizzy spells, hearing loss, and tinnitus or tinnitus that's ringing in the ears. And that one's not showing up at all. Nope. Okay, I guess the graphics don't want to participate anymore. Let's try the last one. No, it's not working either. Of course not. I don't know what is up with the images today, but hey, that one worked. Okay, great. Well, anyway, that's it for some COVID check-in stuff, basically there. And that's as close as I'm going to get the graphic for right now. But there we go. I'm just livid. I mean, I'm beside myself. I don't know what to say at this point. We're just throwing away people's health by the millions, by the tens of millions. Many people around the world still aren't vaccinated at all. The IP hasn't been waived on the vaccines. Transmission isn't being controlled. And now the world is going into, and I think that this is the main point, we are in mid-October. We know that a wave is right around the corner. It happens every year of the pandemic, and it happens in general with the type of disease that this is. It gets transmitted through aerosol transmission and droplets and things like that. We know that less fresh air, all that stuff, and they've completely backed off of everything. We could ask the question of why. I'm not going to try to get into their heads right now of like, where is this decision coming from? But we've also got, signs of a major recession, housing market crash, all this crazy stuff. It's just a complete shitstorm on the horizon. And it's literally, they're doing the exact opposite of what needs to be done. They're removing restrictions rather than tightening them. If ever was the time, to be tightening restrictions, now would be it. This whole let it roll thing, it's not working at all. We looked at the BioBot thing. We're in a massive plateau of COVID, and it's about to probably skyrocket. So anyway. All right, let's go through the comments and close out with some chat for today. Where were we in the chat here? There's a thank you, Health Revolt, for the link between deforestation and COVID. I will check that out later. Yeah, somebody's saying on the Donbas, I was always wondering why they were called, quote, people's republics. Now I know, because they weren't always led by reactionaries. That's why. It is confusing. As humans diminish biodiversity by cutting down forests and building more infrastructure, they're increasing the risk of disease pandemics such as COVID-19. Yeah, well, I mean, living closer to animal populations, of course, can increase the risk of things jumping. So yeah, many ecologists have long suspected this, but a new study helps to reveal why some species are going extinct. Those that tend to survive and thrive, rats and bats for instance, are more likely to host potentially dangerous pathogens that can make the jump to humans. Deforestation concentrates risk to human population, and many ecologists and virologists warned as SARS became dominant as a potential source of spread. Is it safe to take vaccines and boosters now, or long-term effects the more you keep taking? I'm not aware of any evidence like that. You have far more risk overall from the virus than you do from the vaccine. Again, there is, with any type of medicine, there is some amount of safety risk, and there is with the vaccines too. But it's very small, and the main thing you need to compare it to is the risk from the virus. So what are your odds of catching COVID probably very strong because we're now going into a big fall outbreak. And there's no masking, there's no quarantining. People are expected to just like work through it, etc. So you're going to want that protection. And also, mask. Look up Project N95, get yourself a box of like 30, N95s, and, protect yourself. You can also get P100s, there's N100s, there's N99s, there's different kinds of masks. So I wonder if it's safe to get Novavax after you've already had the bivalent booster. So Novavax is not currently approved as a booster. It's approved in, I think, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the EU. And from what I've read, I would get Novavax. I would want to try that. It looks like it works very well. But it is not approved in the US as a booster. It's only approved as a primary series shot, and I think only in certain circumstances. So unfortunately, we can't really get Novavax easily. There are ways that people have sort of schemed to get it, up to and including lying. So, I mean, if you look into that, there's like ways that people are finding that they can get it, but it is pretty difficult to get your hands on the Novavax. So somebody says, I wish I took the immune boosting vaccines and not the mRNA ones. So the mRNA ones are immune boosting. So, yeah, the whole point of this is it introduces the antigen into your system, which your body can then recognize and make antibodies to and learn what it is. So the mRNA ones do that too. Yeah, we covered the COVID origins thing in a previous thing. It's very inconclusive, and right now, my position on the COVID origins is like primarily stopping it is the main concern, and we can maybe figure out where it came from later. But the main thing right now is we've got 20, 40, 60,000 people a day getting long COVID, and that needs to be stopped. So. Yeah, or that was at least at the height of the surge a couple of months ago. It's lower right now, but we don't really know because they're not counting the cases. So, Germany starts talking of ex post triage, maybe because there is a major surge expected. So instead of improving healthcare, prefer to triage patients. What's happening is disgusting, and I'm not really sure. I'm going to be keeping up my COVID agitation and education, obviously, here on the channel. I don't know what it's going to take to be most effective to get through to people. If you don't care about your health and your health and your life, combine two words in one. If you don't care about your health and your life, what do you care about? I just don't get it. If one hasn't been vaxxed yet, they make you take the primary series first, which is the old vaccine, right? I'm not a doctor, but that seems stupid. I'm not sure what happens in that case, but you're right that they're using a completely outdated strain of COVID. It's going to have some benefit because there are some similarities between original strain COVID and the multiple strains we're currently dealing with. There is overlap, but it could be much, 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 much more targeted. It's not a very good match. It's better than nothing, but it does not match the current strains, those old ones. Omicron was like a quantum leap in the mutations, so. Yes, China is one of the only places that is taking COVID seriously. I think even like Vietnam was doing much better with COVID. Apparently they've been relaxing things, and then Luna Oi was just talking about how they got COVID recently. Another communist streamer. Yeah, and this is just what happens. It's like it's very predictable. You relax the restrictions, more people get COVID. Like it's not a complicated math problem. It's really not. There's a lot of discussion of the death penalty in the comments. That's fine. Nobody's trolling, so that's fine. I'm not going to pick that up today. I just want to get through the COVID stuff right now. We've got many sudden speaking of death penalty, we've got an open-air death penalty with COVID going around. We've got many sudden deaths in Greece too, almost all young people, but what can we expect when almost all got COVID this summer due to COVID minimizing politicians and scientists? Yeah, and we can add, left politicians in there as well. The left orgs have not done very well on this subject. The heart complications I see... Sorry, the little pin thing is getting in the way of me reading this. The heart complications I see every young man who comes into work, makes contact with me and was about to pay. He dropped down seizing and foaming at the mouth. I was obviously traumatized, but the first thing I thought was COVID and long COVID. I had no idea what he was going through, but we have a physician's care next door and had a coworker run over. Dude turning blue and customers asking for their orders. Crazy world. He's fine now. I guess he's undiagnosed epileptic. Came back in on my day off. Again, if this is his first seizure, could be COVID-induced. That's terrible. The heart issues scare me a lot. I've been active in some form all my life. I got sick 3 weeks ago, and since then I get heart pain with even light jogging. I was only sick for a few days, not more than 4. Maybe it's just psychosomatic, reading all this on COVID. I think it's probably not psychosomatic. That would be my guess. If you're getting heart pain, something like palpitations, heart fluttering, that can be a more likely symptom of anxiety or something psychosomatic. But, the heart pain, I would definitely get that checked out. Are we discussing COVID? Is it still something that needs to be debated? I thought it was obvious that those infected had long-term health effects. Hey, let me tell you, go out into, if your town has a center, go out into the center of your town with a sign that says COVID causes long-term health effects. Tell me how many people are surprised to hear that, because I'll bet most are. Because where do you hear this anywhere in the news? Like, there's certain things. Forbes is covering it. Fortune's covering it. I'm seeing like a lot of stories coming out of those outlets for some reason. There's like a few places that are covering this regularly. Otherwise, you got to go out of your way to find it. Or it gets mentioned. You'll see it in like Yahoo News or something, but it's never really put in the context of like, we need immediate action on this. They're not calling for politicians to do anything. It's like, hey, maybe we should think about this. But that's been the speed it's at since February. So Joe Biden came in to be the conservative Democratic candidate, and he shut down the pandemic response. He did Vaxxor mask. That killed the pandemic response. We have an article up on the channel that I feel like the headline put it really well. Let me see if I can get it. But it was like the Biden administration, actually I think I know what it is and I don't have to look it up. The Biden administration killed America's collective pandemic response, I think was the title. And that's, truer words never spoken. That's exactly what happened. It's now like, hey, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. Oh my God, we had a hard enough time mandating people to wear a mask. Now you're going to tell them it's optional? What do you think that's going to do? It killed the masking. And then, of course, COVID started spreading more, and we got the Delta outbreak just 2 months later. So, very predictable stuff. This shit scares me too. I don't think I've had COVID yet, barely leave the house, but back in early 2018, I started having scary symptoms. I lost weight and it's better, but they were seemingly cardiovascular symptoms, so yeah. Yeah, we're not debating if it's real. That's not a debate to be had, exactly. Keeping up with the data and the risks and the current variants and things like that. Yes, women are more likely to get long COVID, that's correct. My PCP frequently declares and advocates that 70% of patients in the practice are currently suffering from long COVID and or PASC-like symptoms. Great. Is he political? Because he needs to be getting political. I'm still waiting for the medical and public health, you know, revolt over all this stuff. So yeah, 99% of the U.S. population knows almost none of this, and at least 25% denial on COVID. I think it's more than 25%. Yeah, 99% is probably an overstatement, but 25% is an understatement for sure. Okay, so here's a comment. Not only do I experience seizures ever since I've been infected with COVID, but about a month ago, a friend I know now does as well. I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't say whether it's like some inherent epilepsy or COVID related for sure, but the timing of everything makes me think COVID at the very least plays some amount of a role. The people that act like COVID isn't serious are so goddamn infuriating. Yeah, so epilepsy is like not that common of a condition. And I think that there's a decent chance that that may have been COVID related. Have you had that checked out yet? And I would mention that you had COVID and print out and bring articles with you to the doctor about the links between epilepsy and COVID. I mean, that COVID can induce seizures. So this winter will be a living nightmare. I think you're probably right. I'm horrified by the normalization of mass death and disability due to COVID. People's lives are being sacrificed for the economy, and the economy is shit to begin with. Completely agree. Yeah, I that sounds like more than a coincidence to me. You need some tests to figure out what's going on. In the end, they may not be able to tell you conclusively if the COVID caused it, but you know, you could do some additional research on that. But I mean, yeah, you may never know if the COVID caused it, but you know probably should focus on treating that somehow. You know, getting some treatment for whatever you're experiencing. Yes, COVID can also trigger autoimmune diseases as well. That's one of the theorized like factors in long COVID. There's a number of them, including persistent low-level infection that just never fully goes away. There is like gut microbiome disruption because the gut can be a big reservoir of the virus and can affect some of the microorganisms living there, which are crucial for your overall body functioning. And autoimmunity is another. So, yeah, there's like half a dozen things that probably factor into long COVID. Yeah, people talking about CBD for for epilepsy. That is one of the things that people do take who have epilepsy. I believe the doses are really high, and not everybody can get that. But that is something that people have explored for you know people who have seizures. It's so annoying because when I talk about the necessity of the measures we need to take to stop transmission, everybody just enters Nazi mode and implies whatever happens, happens. Yeah, if he dies, he dies. And say our system isn't authoritarian like China. It's just not feasible here to do lockdowns again. We never did fucking lockdowns in the first place. Even during the most restrictive, quote, lockdown in the US, you could go to the grocery store, you could go to any essential business. So, no. Like, you know, but even that, it was effective at dramatically curtailing the spread. And, you know, even something like that would be a massive step up from what we have now. Also, an N95 mask mandate. That would cut down transmission hugely. And then you could get it down to individual isolated pockets of outbreaks. We're nowhere even near that right now. Yeah. And the comment continued, they're like not even wrong because here we have the wild card that is fascism. Yeah, it is. Anyway. The term mild is annoying the living shit out of me. A disease that can cause brain damage shouldn't ever be considered mild. Yeah. Our overall baseline is now at a delta level high. Yeah, so you can see just the overall standards, the baseline has shifted over last year. NHS is facing drug shortages. In Greece, we face over 400 drug shortages, so we won't be dying only of COVID. Yeah, so this is another. I mean, we were talking yesterday about how a lot of shelves are just empty at places when you go, like a pharmacy or the kind of first aid area of like a supermarket. A lot of times the shelves just don't have a lot of stuff that is normally on there. And, you know, I don't know. Like, I just reach a certain point where with this stuff where we're trying to keep an eye on it. We're trying to remind people. We're trying to increase the consciousness. Ultimately, if action is not taken on this stuff, it's going to get worse and worse. Great, a pill you can buy and then they get more money when you get hospitalized anyway, referring to the Merck pill. Yeah. Yeah, on the epilepsy thing, my understanding is it's just the CBD, which is good because CBD can sort of affect you psychologically a little bit. It's way less debilitating than THC, which, a lot of people don't like at all, or some people do. Obviously, some people like THC a lot. But the CBD is, people may feel sleepy or spacey or whatever, but it's a lot of people can still kind of function on it. Some people actually even find it energizing. It can depend on the person somewhat. But yeah, that's a thing. Actually, if you go on the channel and look, I did a story about, let me see. There was a link between, yeah, so the title is Researchers Say Cannabis Extract, Cannabidiol, CBD, may help to prevent COVID-19 viral replication. So I mentioned in there that the amounts, so basically what they found is that people who had epilepsy, who were taking CBD, which seemed to be helping them to achieve more nervous system balance and fewer seizures, they were also getting COVID at lower rates. So they did more studies, basically, and it seemed like CBD was helping to prevent COVID infections, actually. So kind of a win-win there. But, yeah, definitely, I'll see if I can come up with some links for you on that, because I really don't know a ton about it otherwise. Sorry, I'm writing the word epilepsy, and I started saying the P that I was writing. All right. That sounds not bad. The entire strategy going into this was flatten the curve and with less people in the hospital because they're out sooner. Maybe that's an effective form of medication. Well, no, because the curve isn't going to get flattened. That's the problem. The curve is the number of cases. And if it's just spreading and spreading, that's not going to flatten the curve. So we're treating human life like it's cheap, and forced birthers have the nerve to claim to be pro-life. Yeah, just no kind of a good life. No, it's not endemic, and honestly, your comments are irritating the shit out of me. It's not endemic. So endemic means that there's no change in the rate of cases. It's just steady. And massive waves going up and down is the exact fucking opposite. So yeah, don't talk out your ass when it comes to endemic, and that's a bad talking point. Yeah, we covered this before. Even when it is endemic, like malaria is endemic in certain areas, it doesn't mean it's harmless. Even when it is endemic, I mean, we did this, let me look it up. I think I put it right in the title of the video. There we go. Livestream number 40. We covered Paul Cockshot's anti-LGBTQ plus content, and also a story about COVID-19. Endemic does not mean harmless. If you search on endemic, you'll find it. So yeah, there's a lot of diseases that are endemic the rate is not changing, but they're extremely harmful. So it could also become endemic at a very high rate, like where there's tons of cases a day. So far, it's not endemic at all. And the closest that we've come to it being endemic is this plateau that we've had, in like March, April, May, like that period of time where, yeah, it was flat, but it was flat at a very high level. So, but then it didn't stay that way for long. So, no, learn what the fuck you're talking about. Compare U.S. response and deaths to China. Even if their population was equal, it isn't even close. That is true. Yeah, I mean, if China had done what the U.S. did, they'd have about 5 million, 4.5 million deaths, something like that. It'd be a lot more deaths. And who knows, because there might even be some sort of synergistic effect or multiplying effect due to different conditions there. But yeah, you'd be looking at millions of deaths from COVID, as well as, don't forget, where are these variants coming from? I said it before, replication. Mutations happen during replication, and some of them confer advantage. And if you had, 100 million cases going on in China, I mean, who knows what would have mutated out of that? I mean, as it is, I think it's thought that the Delta strain came out of India, where you have more of that situation. So, where it was allowed to just spread and people weren't vaccinated and on and on because India is really poor. So, there's a good example of how it could have gone. You could have had two countries like that. Of course, I mean, if the IP was lifted and all of that, I mean, everybody could be vaccinated by now. We could be doing N95s as standard, on and on. But of course, the need for profit constrains the science and the public health response. Public health in the United States is kind of a joke. I mean, we don't have any real, like, everything comes second to profit. So any kind of, population health interventions that involve any disruption to profit, it's just not even considered. So, it's very limited. You can study disease outbreak. You can't really do that much about it. You can only do it if it lines up with profits and doesn't disrupt that. In England, the COVID patients in hospital are the unvaccinated mainly. So this raises another thing. That's not always the case because, and then anti-vaxxers will look at the fact that over time, a lot of the hospitalizations or deaths will even be happening in people who, like early on, uh, it depends on the area too. So yeah, overall, your odds of death and hospitalization, if you're unvaccinated or non-vaccinated, whatever, are much, much higher. I think like 8 times higher than a vaccinated person. So by far, that's really important. Where some of this gets a little more complicated is older people are both more likely to be hospitalized and or die, and they're also more likely to be vaccinated. So they can be vaccinated but still end up hospitalized anyway because they got the vaccine, but they were so old and in such poor health that the vaccine still didn't overcome it. So there's different things there that, again, anti-vaxxers know really nothing about science or medicine. So a lot of times you get these like super streamlined, oversimplified, and therefore incorrect, oversimplified to the point of being incorrect takes that just don't account for, other things. I got into a thing on Twitter with somebody about this a while ago, and it went predictably. Let me put it this way. Any doubts I might have ever theoretically had about a vaccine from the kind of arguments that have been made by anti-vaxxers, what they are basing their anti-vax arguments on is not science. They brutally misunderstand the data, like brutally. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's convincing on its face that the vaccines are very effective. Study after study has pointed that out. They're not perfectly effective, and they're not sufficient for stopping the pandemic. We need transmission control for that. But they do have efficacy. They reduce the odds of the worst outcomes and so on. And it's like, I remember way back in the day, before I knew much about, the right or anything, well, I guess I was just starting to get into like understanding what is discussed in the fringe right-wing world and all that kind of thing. I picked up a book at the library on creationism because I was like, really, people are advocating creationism? I couldn't believe it. This was before it kind of became a thing. Like, it was the late 90s. And I was like, somebody wrote a fucking book on creationism? You got to be kidding me. And so I picked it up, and flipping through it, it was some of the worst arguments I had ever read in my life that just logically, like, on their face were so badly flawed. I can't believe anyone published the book. And from then on, I was cured of ever even being at risk of, believing anything like that. And so with the anti-vax stuff, they use some of the worst reasoning you could possibly imagine. Yeah, I understand DPRK also had a better COVID response. I think that they had a bigger outbreak this year. This is owing to, I think, the strains are just worse, and they're, what worked to control the earlier strains is not going to be as effective against these. And this is why we need to stop this thing, because eventually nothing's going to stop it. If it mutates to a point where it's like SARS-1 or MERS, I mean, figuratively, blood will run in the streets. SARS had like a 15% mortality rate, and MERS has like a 35% mortality rate. You do not want to get anywhere near those levels. The lack of self-preservation by people when it comes to COVID is mind-blowing. Even the 3 rules for robotics mention that a robot should preserve itself unless it contradicts the first 2 rules, i.e. harming humans. I kind of feel like there's like a mass death wish going on in the United States. Like, people just, there's something in the culture, there's something among the people where people are just giving up. I don't know what it is. I think it's manifesting. There's just such massive breakdown at this point. But I often conceptualize it as kind of like just a mass death wish among people generally in the U.S. It's hard to explain a lot of the behavior otherwise. How we got to this point is a complex tale of social factors. But I mean, it seems to me that there is just a massively self-destructive element in U.S. culture that is pretty commonplace among people. But yeah, you're right. You're right. It is astounding. Ironic that the economics magazines are covering COVID well. Rich people know what's up. They do. They don't want to die. All right. We're going to be wrapping up in a minute. And I am just finishing up with the comments here. I have not seen that monthly review article, The Fault in Our SARS. Thank you for that link. I will definitely read that. The war in Ukraine won't end anytime soon. I expect it to turn back into a stalemate and war of attrition again in the next few months. Modern warfare has made it near impossible to make serious long-term gains. Again, it's very hard to get any kind of facts. There are a lot of articles coming out of the Western press, whether they're just sheer fabrications for propaganda purposes, psyops or not, I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot written about how the Russian troops are using like terrible old equipment and are very demoralized. I don't know. And are just generally disorganized, but I don't know. It does look like there is a lot of desertion going on. Again, hard to say what's a psyop and what's accurate, though. Truth is the first casualty of war. Everybody is trying to win. Again, the survival imperative. Oh, good. The person who was having the seizures was able to finally see a neurologist and get an EEG done a few weeks ago. Still waiting on the results. With all that being said, the neurologist acted like COVID wasn't a possible factor, but the nurse had a decent discussion on long COVID. Honestly, I'll see if I can get some. I'm already looking up the CBD. I'll see if I can, get you some studies. I'm sure if you research it, you can even find some popular articles on it. But I'll send you some links on the COVID and epilepsy. Because honestly, print them out. Just, print out half a dozen pages and just give it to your doctor and be like, look, here's the studies. Here are the sites. They should be aware of that if they're doing neurology. I mean, COVID has so many neurological impacts. Epilepsy is really just one of them. So they should really be aware of that. Businesses did begin to redefine the term essential during lockdowns, yes. Boy, there's some bad comments. I'm glad that we're wrapping up here because some real strange stuff getting posted. I haven't gotten COVID yet. I've heard N-acetylcysteine works somehow. I haven't, so NAC, people use it for a variety of things. I have not heard anything about that and COVID, no. All right. I think we're going to wrap up right here because I'm about caught up with the chat. And that's it for the week. So hopefully everybody enjoyed this. Like I said, I'll probably be posting this on Friday, tomorrow. I want to give the last stream a little chance to breathe. And then we will be posting some audiobooks on Saturday. So again, thanks to everybody who showed up for the chat today, or almost everybody who showed up for the chat today, except for the people I banned. And thanks to everybody showing up on YouTube, bearing with the unusual images issue, which actually wasn't that big of an issue after all, but it was through me because it was just different than the way I usually do it. Otherwise, engagement. So like, share, subscribe. If you like this, it'll help YouTube to keep recommending it. And we'll see you in the next video.